we're going to discuss how you can diagnose your absolute sleep need, as well as how to recover sleep that you've lost. That block of sleep, and when it falls within each 24-hour cycle, is governed by a number of different things. But the most powerful thing that's governing when you want to be asleep and when you want to be awake is light. And in particular, it's governed by sunlight. It's happening in us all the time without any external input. In fact, if we were in complete darkness, living in a cave with no artificial lights whatsoever, or we were in complete brightness where we never experienced any darkness, these rhythms of cortisol and melatonin would continue. You would have a bump in cortisol or a pulse in cortisol that would drop off with time, and then melatonin would come up about 12 to 14 hours later. But these endogenous systems of our body, which are both hormonal and neural, were set so that external things could govern when they happen. Now, this takes us back to episode 1 of the podcast that if you haven't listened to already, you might want to listen to, where we talked about sensation and perception and all that. I'm not going to review it again here, but there's one particular sensory event, one particular influence on your nervous system that determines when that cortisol is going to start to rise. So if you were in complete darkness, it would happen once per 24-hour cycle, but it would be somewhat later and later each day. Whereas under normal circumstances, what happens is you wake up, and what happens when you wake up? You open your eyes. When you open your eyes, light comes into your eyes. Now, the way this system works is that you have a particular set of neurons in your eye. They're called retinal ganglion cells. You don't have to remember that if you don't want to, but these retinal ganglion cells are brain neurons. Again, the retina is just the one piece of your brain, actually two pieces, because most of you have two retinas, that resides outside the skull per se. When light comes into the eye, there's a particular group of retinal ganglion cells or type of retinal ganglion cells that perceives a particular type of light and communicates that to this clock that resides right above the roof of your mouth called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay? So I know this can get a little complicated, but these retinal ganglion cells, when you open your eyes, light comes in and an electrical signal is sent to this central clock we call the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus has connections with essentially every cell and organ of your body. Now, it's vitally important that we get light communicated to this central clock in order to time the cortisol and melatonin properly. When I say properly, I can say that with confidence because we know, based on a lot of evidence, that if you don't get your cortisol and melatonin rhythms right, there are tremendously broad and bad effects on cardiovascular health, dementia, metabolic effects, learning, depression, dementia. In fact, there's so many negative effects associated with getting this wrong that I don't want to go into it in too much detail. In fact, I feel like we've been bombarded with all this information about how we're not sleeping well, we're not sleeping at the right times, we're not sleeping enough, to the point where people now have sleep anxiety. If they can't sleep well for a night, they're feeling overwhelmed by that, and it's sort of now they're stressed about not being able to sleep, which is making it harder to sleep, etc. I really want to focus on what we can do to anchor these systems properly. So let's think about what happens when we do this correctly and how to do it correctly. When we wake up, our eyes open.